Welcome to a brand new show, System Overload, How Change Happens. I'm your host, Wright, and I'll steer a conversation between two of the best business strategists to help demystify a subject we encounter daily, yet rarely are taught how to deal with: change. For the next 30 minutes, today's guest will offer case studies and frameworks on a topic facing a widespread reset: organizational design and corporate culture. I'm joined by Kristen Cavallo, the CEO of the Martin Agency based in Richmond, Virginia, whose clients include UPS, DoorDash, Geico, gaming company Hasbro, Oreo, Hanes, TIAA for retirement, and CarMax. And in 2019, she was Ad Age's A-List Executive of the Year. And I'm also joined by business powerhouse Rita McGrath, who's a professor at Columbia Business School, approaching her 30th anniversary in 2023. She's a best-selling author and internationally recognized as one of the top 5 business thought leaders in the world, based on Thinkers 50 and Harvard Business Review. Welcome. I'm so excited to have the both of you because I have followed the work of Kristen and you for years. So we're going to get into the books, the ideologies, the reasons why you're some of the most talked about individuals in your industries, and some of the lessons that you have to give to the advertising, marketing, communication landscape, and also what's happening with media. So let's get into a little bit of an icebreaker, since you both are such great strategic thinkers. For those of you that don't know, Kristen started her career as a strategic planner in advertising and rose to chief strategy officer before she became CEO. And Rita trains managers, executives, and entrepreneurs all across the world. So here's the question that I have for both of them. And let's start with Kristen. In terms of advice, what's the hardest part of change and why? And how do people break through?
I think the expected answer on the hardest part of change would be that people resist it, that it's trying to put something in motion that is resisting being in motion. But I would say something that I have struggled more with than that is that change attracts critics like flies. And I read somewhere in a book that leadership is like being kissed and slapped at the same time. And I think when you add change in the midst of that, it just makes the slapping all the more prevalent. So I've learned, and I'm learning, how to de-emphasize needing or wanting to be liked, because I feel like comfort and change are often in tension, and just try to focus on making decisions that I feel like I can live with, and then earning the respect of the people who directly report to me and who are most immediately influenced by the changes that we're implementing.
All right. Thank you so much, Kristen. Rita, what's your general thoughts on the hardest part of change and why?
It's getting the necessary ingredients to play together well. So this was a framework that was developed by Michael Beer at Harvard. And what he said was, to get a successful change going, you need to have constructive dissatisfaction with the way things are. So there's got to be something that's wrong. You have to have a vision for where you want to go. And the hardest part of all is then you need a process for eliminating the obstacles between where you are and where you need to be. And those things are multiplicative. And so if any one of them is 0, your change effort's going to add up to 0.
Yeah, thank you so much. So both of you talk about mindset, dealing with friction, and then some key considerations. So maybe we can drill down before we go into a few case studies and strategic frameworks. In terms of mindset, maybe we can go back to Kristen. As a leader, what mindset or attitude do you try to have when you're approaching change?
I try to be open-minded. I mean, that's the first thing, right? I mean, good ideas, people often say good ideas can come from anywhere, but to really believe that and practice it, you have to kind of push down your own biases in order to open yourself up to the ideas and influences of others. And that often for me means tactically that I try to have a very much of an open door policy and make myself as available as possible so that people feel like they can come bring forth new ideas that make me think in different and interesting ways. And then the second thing I try to do is act quickly. And I know those two things also might seem at odds, but I find that that fear grows when things aren't moving. And so I try to pivot. And if I find that we're moving in a bad direction, I pivot again. So I get us kind of used to constant change, like living in permanent beta, as opposed to big moments of change that seem to drive heart rates and blood pressure up.
Yeah. And Rita, I'm sure that listening to Kristen's CEO experience and Chief Strategy Officer experience in terms of navigating and leading change probably reminds you of some of the issues or advice that you often give CEOs and senior managers in terms of their mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say is most common for them to know, or the most common mindset for them to shift away from? What's your general thoughts around mindset?
Well, I talk about a new playbook for strategy, which involves going from the assumption that change is the weird thing and stability is the normal thing to reverse those things. We also need to think about disengagement, right? So part of why change is hard is it often means letting go of things that were precious to us at once. It might mean moving resources around the organization, which is often resisted and contested. It means innovation, right? It has to be part of how we do things. It can't just be this thing that happens once every 10 years. And it really puts different requirements on leadership, where I would argue they need to be more discovery driven than perhaps historically was the emphasis.
Yeah, well, thank you for those anchoring principles. And we're going to get into those one by one in a moment. And I love that we're able to have the both of you presenting such different yet complementary perspectives in terms of the micro view of how it actually happens in the organization. How do you create that elbow room for change? And then the macro view from an industry and multiple company perspective. And so as we progress, that's what you can expect if you're watching or listening to us in terms of different perspectives. So in this part, we're going to talk about some case studies. And we're going to talk about a few frameworks that Rita has developed over her illustrious career. Some of those frameworks, which Harvard Business Review has said are so important, they're the top 5 business ideas in the world. And like Beyonce, she is not number 5. So we're going to get into those, starting with the end of competitive advantage and build on some of those leadership traits. Kristen, before we do, would love to start off with talking about the Martin Agency and a pretty bold commitment that you made. Can you tell us more around how you're approaching management and agency operations in the sense of production, in the area of creativity that many individuals from a senior level standpoint, from an employee standpoint, would love to see shift, right? Different individuals in front of the camera, but different individuals behind it also. So how have you started to tackle that change?
I watched a documentary by the Gina Davis Institute, and it was primarily about the lack of women in directing roles, and the moments where you feel like you've busted through and there's going to be long-term change, and then it kind of pulls back, and this constant one step forward, 2 step backs that have been going on for years and years. And after watching the video, my executive committee, we watched it together, and then we brought in the Gina Davis Institute, Madeline DeMono, and she came in and talked a lot about the changes they're trying to affect. We screened it for the whole agency, which I think is all part of trying to facilitate and create change, right? Is to broaden everyone's aperture. And then we discussed it both at the officer level, at the overall staff level, about what we could do as people in this industry that have a pretty decent production overall budget and spend with those clients, and how could we push change through. And so we made a commitment to try to have 50% of our productions be helmed by underrepresented talent, which we defined by race, gender, and ability. And again, the podcast was mostly, or the film, the documentary is mostly focused on gender, but we broadened it to the best of our ability and really worked with production partners and clients to ensure that we were operationalizing this belief in this opportunity all the way through the entire production process.
Yeah. And you had some partners in terms of the commitment. Do you want to talk about where the partnership kind of began? And also, when we think about the levers of change, there can be some blockers, such as processes or policies. So how did you bridge wanting to do the change with bringing clients along and bringing individuals that may have existing relationships within the agency in order to say, this can be something that has an impact and is great for us and great for the market, great for our clients?
It's we had to both partner with clients, DoorDash, Geico, but really, I mean, a large number of our clients. And no client said no. That's the really important thing. And I would tell you, I think it's been a mission of our agency to embrace different ways of thinking and underrepresented talent. Again, being gender, but also race and ability. And so I think when a lot of the clients that work with us already value those things, there's a sense of like-minded commitment and value out of the gate, working them with the production partners. And in some cases, it would mean taking chances and trying people that might be new or have a less work in their book or less experience in order to bring this to bear, which means we have to take more chances, but also build in more hours, build more commitment to making sure that things go well. And I will tell you, I think our work this year is so different because of that commitment and so unexpected that it ended up fueling itself. The more and more that people saw the work that came out and how different and impactful the work was, the easier it became for everyone to relinquish that control a little bit and trust that it doesn't mean that the way we've been doing it in the past, that we let go of the idea that the past has to be better and that perhaps the future would be better and more interesting and more impactful than the way we've done it in the past. And so the stories fueled themselves.
All right, so let's bring in Rita because she is an expert when it comes to the future versus the present versus the past. How do you weigh the potential and the opportunities that exist within them? And so Rita, maybe we can build on some of the insights from the end of competitive advantage. And with that, one of the central things that you argue is this myth of sustainable competitive advantage, which I think Kristen starts to get at in terms of willingness to deconstruct, willingness to see the future and move forward. That's a skill that not many leaders have. They think we invested all this time and money and training in this competitive advantage. We have to defend it. We can't possibly shift away from it. These relationships that we have from production, these savings that we get and built over time that we pass through. Why would we ever give those up? So Rita, can you tell us a little bit more around that myth of sustainable competitive advantage and what your research has uncovered?
Sure. So the idea came from the early days of strategy when, industries had fairly clearly defined boundaries. A lot of entry barriers existed because we were talking about physical things, right? Steel and refrigerators, cars and stuff like that. But what we've seen over the past few decades is entry barriers have really come down. So to give an example, if I wanted to get a video message to 100 million people in 1990, which is not that long ago, you would have hired burly guys with cameras on their shoulders, and you would have filmed on acetates, and you would have put them in cans and taken them to the post office. I mean, it would have been a multi-million-dollar effort. Today, like two kids in a garage with hardly even a very good smartphone can get that job done if the thing goes viral enough, and they can do it for nothing. And so entry barriers have really come down with the consequence that most advantages are pretty easy to copy, with the exception of the one that Kristen's alluded to, which is human capital.
Yeah. And so when we think about that model of competitive advantages and when to invest, when not to invest, what I love about your work is just this broadening sense of competitive arenas, right? Someone else is going to eat your lunch And that may not even come from someone who you expect. So Kristen, I think you've experienced that your biggest competitors now are what? Consulting agencies, other types of strategy shops, not just necessarily within the advertising landscape. So it's incredibly impressive that you've been able to do something in terms of reconfiguring processes that many agencies have not, which is giving up the pitch. And that takes so many resources in terms of trying to go out and win new business. It can be really demoralizing and deflating to people. They put their all into it in their heart and then they don't get it. So what a better way of just getting work. So you've won, for instance, different work from Google, Royal Caribbean, and Hasbro. How has the policy or the process changed in terms of putting forward a new representation so that you don't have to do the classic big pitch, take a lot of time courting? What has that experience been like? Any backlash, any impact so far?
Well, we definitely still pitch, but I'd say we're far more selective of where we invest our time. And it starts with us, to be quite honest. It starts with us believing that time is our most precious resource, and giving it away for free is not always great business. And so we have to be very selective where we choose to give away our time, and set realistic expectations up front with the client. And I think what goes along hand in hand with that self-respect would be a level of candor. I think when we are able to sit with clients and explain the approach, I think they see and more often understand that we're not doing so because we're being difficult as much as we are making sure that the time and investment we spend is in the place of highest probability of where we're going to end up with a very collaborative, high-functioning relationship. And the hard part about this is, again, I think it often starts with us, but when we find those like-minded clients, we have found that it's not that difficult to change the way and the approach with which we do things. It's beneficial for them as well, because the pitch doesn't always end up with a very long or successful relationship. I don't know that correlation exists in the same way that perhaps it might have, especially post-COVID.
Yeah. Well, Rita, one of the things that you talk about in your work and you just referenced is continuous reconfiguration, which is one of many elements in terms of your transient competitive advantage model. Maybe you can talk more about that model. And I know that you have work that you also do with organizations to help them think about how to reconfigure. And so I think within the healthcare space, there has been work that you may have some insights about. Maybe you can tell us about continuous reconfiguration, and then if you can share any examples from healthcare, that'll be great.
Okay, sure. So I'll echo something Kristen said earlier, which is you're much better off doing change as a whole series of being in motion kinds of steps than you are sort of fire the left-hand side of the building. I mean, by the time you get to a need for that drastic change, chances are you've been ignoring weak signals for far too long. Well, one of the programs I've been involved with, specifically at Genentech, has been a program to elevate their Black and Latinx populations. And they've gone very public as a declaration that they're going to double the number by 2025, I believe is the target goal. And so we've been working very collaboratively on how do we give those individuals the sort of enterprise mindset that they need to thrive, but how do we also influence the organization so that they have a better chance of being successful? And we've just come off a very, very intensive collaborative program that we worked on together. And that's a vehicle for change, really getting these executives into the right mindset and also exposing them to the very senior levels of leadership.
Yeah, I think often when it comes to different fields, there are varying levels of opportunity to engage and immerse with individuals that may be more senior. Healthcare, financial services, there's often kind of the floor that the executives sit on, and then everyone else, everywhere else. And so you don't have a lot of that natural ability to interact that I think sometimes may exist within different agencies or media companies where it's more of that newsroom type of environment. But I think that's a really great point. In order to shift that mindset, really start to intentionally get different groups of individuals to engage and interact with each other. One of the things that you mention in your most recent book, Rita, Seeing Around Corners, is inflection points. And today we've talked a little bit about how to anticipate changes in the future and proactively, preemptively get ahead of them before that disruption gets a hold of you, and then you become reactionary to it. So in terms of inflection points, can you tell us a little bit about the main heart or thesis of that publication?
Sure. So I define a strategic inflection point as something that is a 10x change, typically in your environment. So 10x faster, 10x cheaper, 10x more convenient. And I've been playing around with that idea for a long time. And I wondered, well, what do I do with this? And what I realized was they feel when they appear, right, when they reach that tipping point, they feel as though they came out of nowhere. But when you actually go back and look, most strategic inflection points have been underway for years, if not decades. And so that's the strategic opportunity. How do you track those weak signals so that when one happens, it can take your business to new heights instead of causing it to go into decline?
Yeah. Well, the part of tracking trends is something that is native to most individuals within advertising and media. And so I think that type of skill set is developed. But the idea of acting on those signals that individuals get is what we have to develop as more of a muscle. And Kristen earlier talked about trying to act quickly. And so one of the things that the Martin Agency has done is create an visibility brief. And that is one of the new processes, I think, of anticipating where new audiences, new stories, new voices are going to come from in the future, not just globally, but even within the United States. We know that by the year 2030, we're going to have a new multicultural or audience, rather, a new majority minority when the flippening happens. And so for the first time, we'll have more individuals in the young generation that's multicultural than we do in older generations. So Kristen, when you think about changes and trends like that, and as Rita puts it, how to look around the edges, right, of in the periphery of what's happening in society. Tell us more about the invisibility brief and why that was important at the time that it was rolled out. And what was the process? What was the reaction to changing the way that you get work signed off on with clients and then bring them along the journey in terms of how to activate?
Well, you know, the ad industry often has been ridiculed for not having enough representation in the people that make the ads. Again, going by gender, you know, with the 3% conference was really big on trying to show that at the time when that was first born, that the representation of women in the creative department was 3%. And yet we all know that women are the majority you know, purchasers of a lot of products, and that expanded obviously by race and ability. And so our planning department really took the lead and took the charge on creating an addendum to the briefing process, which for advertising is the impetus that we use to kick off a project, and asked an additional range of questions to help us see beyond our own biases. Literally, there's a bias firewall group of questions that asks you to think for yourself for a minute. Am I working in a category or with a target audience or with an experience that is different than my own lived experience? And is there anything that I should know? And just by asking yourself these questions, like, do I need to go to school on this? And what assumptions am I bringing to the table? It affords you a little bit of permission to be a novice and to look at things from a fresh perspective, because I think often our timelines are so condensed that you feel a little bit like you need to be an expert. And it's hard because when people question your intentions based on, you know, if you're a man and somebody questions whether or not you can relate to a woman who might be purchasing a product, or if you're a Caucasian and you're addressing someone who is not who is a person of color, people might question your intent, and that makes your job harder. But the onus is on us to go through the process of learning to be open-minded. And I think the more marketing shifts and actually is thought of as R&D instead of as a megaphone for what was, it's seen as an investment into what is coming, much like Rita's book about going around corners, then the more permission we get to start over and to start with a blank slate and to question ourselves. And it's really, really important. We just have to do it with a lot more speed and get into almost an exercise habit of interrogating yourself a little bit. And I would say it's not easy, but I think over time you find with other people doing it with you too, that you can do so without a lot of judgment. But that's really the kind of culture you have to build, is how can you feel liberated to open your mind without feeling judged for doing so. And it's a hard balance to walk, because we all need to, and not we all, but a lot of people need to and want to be open-minded, but we have to have permission, not of ourselves, but also from the other people in the room that allow us that grace.
Yeah. And in the few minutes that we have left, I'd love to cover one last topic. And that is building on what you just said. What do people need permission to do, right? And I think Rita would call that permission to be curious. And as she frames, when you have true curiosity, then you have a superpower. So Rita, maybe you can tell us, in terms of the new strategy playbook that we should be moving forward, our industry loves a good listicle, right? And so there are 6 different tenets that you have observed and worked with leaders in terms of making sure they can be implemented from a strategy standpoint. So maybe you can close us out by talking about the 6 different traits that we need to make sure we're wiring into how organizations and corporate culture operates.
Absolutely. So the first one is one we've touched on, which is being agile enough to be in constant motion. The second one is learning to stop things without a lot of rending of hair and garments and anguish. I call that healthy disengagement. The third is getting your best resources against your best opportunities, because as Lou Gerstner famously once said, the typical organization puts their best people on problems. The exceptional organization puts their best people on opportunities. Then we have innovation, but getting beyond what I call innovation theater. Let's have a boot camp. Thousands of Post-it notes die a horrible death while we ideate. Actually doing it for real, right? So getting great ideas, incubating them, getting them out into the world. And all this requires a new kind of leadership, which I call discovery-driven leadership. And in fact, I have a LinkedIn course by that name, which is all about helping the organization to do what it needs to do. And I think Kristen's modeled that for us just beautifully. And lastly, we're all living now in a different environment for talent, which Reid Hoffman has very famously called the tour of duty career environment. And so you're dealing with people who may not be looking at a career ladder. You're looking at people who may be thinking of it in terms of a career lattice, where they're going to be with many organizations over the course of a career.
All right. Well, one last thought that I hope to get from Kristen as we start to wind down our 30 minutes together. And that is building on that last point that you made, Rita, in terms of careers as a tour of duty, where this employee-employer relationship has to be aligned around values and impact. And I think when it comes to values and impact, that's one area that many people think of Kristen in. And so Kristen, earlier in 2022, defended the industry in terms of where we are in terms of creative productivity. And Kristen, I'd love for you to just give us one last thought around values and impact. Many individuals know that you took on the CEO of Coinbase in terms of how he views creative work coming out. But where do you think about values and impact as a leader?
I think they're crucial. I think people have to believe in something more than just their day-to-day existence, and they sign up to align with brands, and hopefully companies think of themselves as brands that they believe in. And so that moment for me was as much as sticking up for the people that I know in the industry, and versus going against an individual. It was more sticking up for a bunch of people that I believe in. But I think values are what keeps your retention high. It's what prevents your turnover. It adds employee participation and morale, and it gives you a reason to come to work every day that is bigger and more profound, and often can help override some of the day-to-day disappointments or toils that we all have to deal with in any industry.
Yeah. Well, definitely want to thank you for being a leader that models how to put those values into practice with behavior and does it on a consistent basis. And so thank you for joining me and Kristen Cavallo and Rita McGrath over the last 30 minutes as we've discussed different case studies and frameworks. Be sure to watch Rita's new LinkedIn Learning course on discovery-driven leadership and read her work in Harvard Business Review. Just to bring Kristen and Rita back, is there one book or resource or piece of inspiration that you would like to close us out on in terms of pushing forward for other individuals? Maybe we can start with Kristen.
Well, I'm going to buy Rita's book. Are you kidding me? I mean, that has to be first. But for me, the other one would be, and it's an oldie, but it's the one that I go back to most often, which is Strength Finders by Marcus Buckingham, which is really about understanding the things that you're good at and how to double down on those things to be great at them, and kind of letting go of the things that are not really in your zone of genius, to use Elaine Weltroth's quote there from her masterclass. The freedom of letting go the things in which you're weak, and so that you have the permission to focus in areas where you're good and you can be great.
All right. Thank you. Rita, any final thoughts?
I love that. I'm very partial to Safi Bakal's book, Loom Shots, because he talks about these new ideas that when they're first born, they're really ugly puppies. But if you can nurture them properly and get them into the right environment, they can really, cure diseases, win wars, and really change the course of history.
All right. Thank you so much, Kristen and Rita, for joining. Maybe we can close out by just showing all of the great best-selling books that Rita has written over the years. And in terms of her works, you can go to her website, ritamcgrath.com, and check those out and follow them both on Twitter and LinkedIn and any other social platforms, as well as YouTube. For all those that love video, they are always doing some really phenomenal interviews. You can replay this episode at adage.com/system overload. That's adage.com/system overload. Join us in 2023 for more discussions between senior executives and the best business thinkers in the world to unpack how change happens through system overload. Let's get to work.